Under the vaulted chambers of the Galactic Empire's council, where countless voices echoed with authority, the lone figure of an aged warrior spoke, his words slow but weighted with scars no one else in the room carried. His body bore reminders of conflicts fought before half the representatives had even taken their seats of power, yet his voice was met not with reverence but with amused dismissal. They saw him as relic, a survivor of forgotten border wars, not as someone carrying knowledge worth heeding. Still, he persisted, because he had seen something no statistic, no military archive, and no economic assessment could explain. He had seen humans fight. He began with no embellishment, for none was needed. He told them how humanity's armies, unrefined and small by imperial standards, refused to yield when cornered. Their ships cracked and burned in the void, their cities leveled, their fleets shattered, yet they fought on with a fire that mocked the calculus of war. Soldiers pressed forward even after their commanders had fallen. Civilians, untrained and terrified, improvised weapons, striking back against occupations rather than submitting. To the veteran, the pattern was unmistakable. They did not fear war, not because they were too foolish to understand its weight, but because they embraced it as a crucible in which they proved themselves. The council laughed at the notion. To them, fear was the cornerstone of dominance. Entire civilizations had folded at the mere sight of imperial banners, their populations enslaved before a single shot was fired. Entire sectors had been won without deploying more than token fleets, because the terror of the empire's reputation was often enough. But humans lacked this reflex. They did not crumble beneath intimidation. The veteran explained this clearly, but his words sounded like exaggeration to leaders who trusted only numbers. They counted fleets, weapons, industry, and logistics. They dismissed anything that could not be measured. Courage, stubbornness, fury, such things were not assets in their ledgers. He described the first time he saw human soldiers fight. Their technology had been crude, barely able to withstand a single strike from Imperial artillery. Their armor was little more than layers of hardened composites, their rifles primitive compared to the Empire's plasma lances. Yet when confronted, they charged without hesitation, closing distance with suicidal determination. They fell by the dozens, the hundreds, but not a single one turned to flee. Their formation dissolved into chaos, but within the chaos burned something terrifying, individuals acting not from orders but from will. They fought on even when defeat was assured, as if the act of resistance itself was victory enough. The veteran recalled their eyes most of all. Where he expected to see despair, he saw a clarity that unsettled him. These were not soldiers shackled by fear of commanders or indoctrination. They were volunteers, men and women who had chosen to fight fully aware of the cost. He had witnessed species who fought because obedience demanded it, others who fought because fear of punishment outweighed fear of death. Humans were different. They fought because they refused not to. That refusal was the core of what made them dangerous. The council chambers grew restless as he spoke. Some muttered that old battles had warped his perspective. Others accused him of trying to sow hesitation in a time when the Empire sought expansion into human-claimed sectors. Their pride blinded them. They believed humanity was simply another obstacle, another primitive race destined to be folded into the Empire's machinery. The veteran told them that conquering such a species would not be clean, would not be efficient, and above all, would not end the way they imagined. He warned that each battle would multiply resistance, that every fallen human would ignite the will of 10 more. The Empire's strength, designed to crush quickly and instill fear, would not serve against those who did not fear it. Still, his warnings fell on deaf ears. They accused him of nostalgia, of exaggerating isolated skirmishes into grand lessons. Yet the veteran pressed harder. He insisted that humanity's lack of fear was not recklessness but calculation. War, to them, was not an aberration of existence but a part of it. Their history was written in blood and fire long before they reached the stars. Kingdoms, nations, tribes, they had waged war upon each other for thousands of years, and through this endless crucible they had forged resilience unknown to any empire-bred race. The Empire's wars were expansions, humanity's wars were survival itself. His last words hung heavy, even as they dismissed him. He said the Empire's mistake would not be underestimating human technology or their fleets, but underestimating their spirit. You believe war will break them, he said, voice sharp despite his frailty. But war is the language they already speak. You cannot frighten them into submission. You cannot erase their resolve. Every strike you deliver will make them stronger, because they do not fear war. They fear only chains, and for that, they will tear your empire apart. The chamber responded with silence, not of belief but of condescension. They thought him dramatic, a veteran too haunted by memory to judge the present. Yet beyond the walls, humanity prepared, not trembling, but sharpening their will. The Empire had heard his warning, but it had not listened. That was the first mistake. The first clashes between the Empire and humanity unfolded with a confidence so absolute from the Imperial side that no one questioned the outcome. The fleets dispatched were considered routine forces, not even the full strength of the armadas. Their commanders treated the campaign as little more than a drill, a way to remind their soldiers how conquest was carried out. They encountered Earth's defenders with laughter on their lips, mocking the crude hulls and outdated engines that carried human ships into the void. On charts, it was not even a war but a one-sided eradication. Yet what followed defied the logic of imperial warfare. Human fleets disintegrated under the opening barrage, as expected, but instead of retreating or surrendering, survivors hurled themselves directly into the teeth of the assault. Damaged craft that could no longer maneuver deliberately rammed into larger enemy ships. Fighters pressed suicidal charges through walls of plasma fire, aiming to strike at engines or bridge sections with explosives strapped to their hulls. Even when their fleets lay in wreckage, human transmission lines filled the void with defiance, voices of commanders and civilians alike swearing that the fight would continue. To Imperial ears, these broadcasts were madness. To the veteran who had warned them, they were confirmation of everything he had said. Occupation forces soon discovered a truth the High Council had dismissed. Humans did not collapse when their cities were taken. Instead, occupation bred a form of resistance that spread faster than the invaders could contain. Every ruined street became a trap, every corner a potential ambush. Civilians, stripped of power and weapons, improvised with whatever they could grasp: broken pipes, homemade explosives, or stolen imperial tools turned into sabotage devices. Garrisons found themselves under constant harassment, not from armies but from ordinary people who refused to accept defeat. This was not organized rebellion at first, but scattered eruptions of refusal, and yet it achieved more disruption than any planned campaign. Imperial doctrine relied on shock, overwhelming firepower, and the psychological weight of inevitability. Entire civilizations had fallen without firing a shot, convinced resistance was useless. Humans inverted this principle. They treated every defeat as fuel, every atrocity as proof that surrender was impossible. Rather than collapsing, they were hardened with each setback. Soldiers who escaped destruction reorganized instantly, operating in small, mobile groups that struck suddenly and vanished. They fought without the rigid structures the Empire expected. Decentralization, to the invaders, looked like chaos, but in that chaos was an adaptability that proved devastating. When one city was leveled, survivors from its ruins became the core of new resistance cells elsewhere. When entire units were annihilated, lone survivors carried messages of defiance that inspired others to pick up arms. The Empire sought to demonstrate overwhelming superiority, but each demonstration only deepened human resolve. To the Imperials, this was incomprehensible. They could not fathom a species that absorbed destruction and translated it into motivation. Their analysts wrote reports about human recklessness, labeling their behavior as primitive emotional reaction. Yet what appeared reckless was deliberate. Humans accepted disproportionate losses not as failure but as proof of their determination. In space, the pattern repeated. Damaged human ships never abandoned the field willingly. Crews fought to the last breath, buying seconds, minutes, hours, anything that could slow the Imperial advance. Such resistance should have been strategically meaningless, yet the cumulative effect grew. The Empire began losing time in a war it had expected to conclude in weeks. Convoys required heavier escorts, garrisons demanded reinforcement, and every delay increased the cost of occupation. Humans, even when shattered, refused to grant their enemies the satisfaction of stability. Most alarming to imperial officers was the psychology of prisoners. Other conquered species broke quickly under interrogation, revealing codes, locations, and weaknesses. Humans resisted to a degree that unsettled their captors. Some remained silent despite torture, others fed misinformation, leading entire patrols into deadly ambushes. There were even cases of captured humans feigning compliance only to strike suddenly within prison facilities, sparking riots that forced entire installations into lockdown. The Empire had expected easy assimilation. Instead, every captured human became another front in the conflict. The veteran's words echoed with growing weight. He had warned that humans feared chains more than death, and the Empire was beginning to see it firsthand. Wherever the Imperial presence tightened, resistance multiplied. The soldiers who fought them were not fearless in the absence of danger, they were fearless in the face of certainty. Knowing they might die, they chose to fight anyway. For a military system built on intimidation, this was poison. Reports to the High Council grew increasingly uneasy. Commanders began admitting that something in their enemy's nature defied conventional strategy. Colonies scheduled for swift integration were becoming quagmires of endless skirmishes. Fleets tasked with securing human trade routes found themselves under constant harassment by smaller, more mobile forces. Casualties mounted in a way the Empire had never known from a species deemed technologically inferior. Still, the Council clung to arrogance, insisting victory was only delayed, not endangered. Yet beneath the surface, cracks formed. For the first time in generations, the Empire faced an enemy that did not understand how to bow. What had been assumed to be a short campaign was becoming a test of endurance. And endurance was a field in which humanity thrived. As months dragged into years, the Empire found itself entangled in a campaign that no longer resembled conquest but attrition. The resources poured into subduing humanity outweighed initial estimates by magnitudes, and still the desired submission never arrived. Instead, the deeper the Empire pressed, the more humanity adapted. At first, their resistance was reactive, fueled by desperation. Over time, it became calculated, coordinated, and frighteningly inventive. What had begun as scattered defiance transformed into a doctrine of warfare that the Empire was ill-prepared to confront. Human commanders began exploiting every gap in Imperial methods. They studied the rhythm of patrols, the deployment habits of garrisons, and the vulnerabilities of larger vessels that assumed smaller craft posed no danger. Makeshift fleets emerged from salvaged wreckage, refitted with ingenuity that defied Imperial expectations of primitive engineering. Systems stripped bare of resources still produced weapons fashioned from industrial machinery, crude yet effective enough to kill soldiers who believed themselves untouchable. Each setback taught humanity lessons, and unlike most species, they never waited for orders to apply them. Initiative was not merely tolerated but celebrated, making every cluster of survivors a potential new front. The Empire's great strength, its uniformity and discipline, became a liability against such opponents. Imperial soldiers trained to follow strict doctrine found themselves bewildered by enemies who never repeated the same tactic twice. Raids struck from impossible angles, attacks launched at times when no rational commander would waste energy. What looked illogical on the surface revealed itself as deliberate unpredictability. Humans excelled at improvisation, forcing the Empire to exhaust itself trying to anticipate a foe that thrived on surprise. Psychological warfare also shifted in humanity's favor. Propaganda intended to instill despair instead became a rallying cry. Broadcasts showing human defeats were intercepted and repurposed, turned into symbols of endurance rather than submission. Images of ruined cities circulated not as warnings but as proof of resilience. Each casualty was memorialized as a hero, their names carried like banners into battle. In their culture, loss did not weaken resolve, it sharpened it. This inversion of meaning baffled the Empire. Every atrocity meant to break them only tightened their grip on unity. Among Imperial officers, whispers began circulating that the humans were different from any opponent encountered before. Veterans of previous campaigns admitted in private that fighting them felt like waging war against the concept of resistance itself. There was no single leader to kill, no command structure to collapse, no cultural weakness to exploit. Every attempt at decapitation only shifted the fight to another front. The realization dawned that humanity's history had prepared them for this very scenario. Millennia of conflict had sculpted their instincts, embedding warfare into the marrow of their civilization. Where other species dreaded the thought of sustained conflict, humans had been tempered by it for generations. The Empire's fleets remained larger, its armies more numerous, but the balance of will tilted. Casualties, once brushed aside as negligible, began to erode morale among Imperial soldiers. To fight an enemy that refused to accept the rules of defeat was to bleed endlessly with no sense of finality. Human raids behind enemy lines destroyed supply routes once considered impregnable. Small forces infiltrated installations and sabotaged critical infrastructure, forcing commanders to divert resources to endless defense. For every base secured, 2 more fell under attack. The war that should have ended swiftly stretched into an open wound, draining strength that could not be replenished. More alarming than the tactical strain was the spreading infection of human defiance among other species under Imperial rule. Conquered worlds watched broadcasts of humanity's refusal to bow and began questioning the inevitability of Imperial dominance. Small rebellions ignited across sectors that had long been quiet, emboldened by the knowledge that one species, technologically inferior, was holding its ground against the greatest power in the galaxy. The Empire suddenly found itself not only at war with humans but with the idea that resistance was possible. Strategists within the Council still clung to arrogance, dismissing reports as exaggerations. They insisted victory was inevitable because numbers demanded it. Yet beneath their declarations ran a quiet unease. The war was bleeding the Empire, not in catastrophic defeats but in relentless, grinding friction. Humanity could not win in traditional terms, but they did not need to. They only needed to endure longer than the Empire's patience. And endurance was a battlefield where humans had proven themselves unmatched. The veteran who had first warned of this outcome remained unheeded, though his words echoed louder with every report. He had said war was the language humanity understood, and now the Empire was forced to converse in it daily. What was meant to be a swift act of dominance had evolved into a struggle that challenged the very foundation of Imperial strategy. The realization loomed unspoken but undeniable. This was not a conflict the Empire could resolve by brute strength alone. Humanity had shifted the war from the domain of weapons to the realm of will, and in that contest, the Empire had no advantage. The turning point of the war arrived not with a grand battle, but with the steady accumulation of small victories that reshaped the balance of power. Humanity, once thought fractured and weak, began forging alliances within their own scattered colonies and across sympathetic species that had long resented the Empire's dominion. What the Council had dismissed as isolated defiance coalesced into a network of resistance too vast to crush. Human ingenuity extended beyond the battlefield. They turned diplomacy into another weapon. They convinced others that the Empire could bleed, that resistance was not futile but achievable. Each alliance brought new resources, hidden safe havens, and fresh recruits who had seen enough of Imperial arrogance to join the cause. While the Empire maintained superiority in numbers, their forces stretched thin across countless fronts. Human strategy exploited this by targeting supply chains, striking at logistical arteries rather than contesting raw military strength. Convoys burned, depots vanished in firestorms, and forward bases withered without reinforcement. The Empire, built on overwhelming projection of force, found its vast machinery grinding slower, while humanity grew more coordinated with each passing cycle. Their fleets no longer resembled ragtag survivors but disciplined formations, weaving together their unconventional tactics with captured technology. Where once they fought only with desperation, they now fought with precision, crafting traps that ensnared even seasoned Imperial admirals. Infiltration became a hallmark of human resistance. Soldiers slipped behind enemy lines disguised as laborers or traders, carrying sabotage equipment small enough to be mistaken for tools. Entire garrisons collapsed overnight from a single detonation planted in power cores. At the same time, hackers among humanity discovered ways to breach Imperial networks, corrupting data, altering navigation charts, and turning the Empire's reliance on order against itself. A species underestimated as unsophisticated displayed adaptability not just in battle but in every facet of conflict. Where Imperial structure demanded predictability, humans thrived in disruption. The psychological toll on Imperial soldiers deepened. Reports emerged of units refusing deployment to human sectors, citing unbearable attrition and fear of an enemy that would not break. Veterans returned with haunted expressions, describing foes who fought even as fire consumed them, who laughed as they detonated charges that claimed themselves and their enemies alike. Imperial propaganda attempted to suppress these stories, but rumors spread regardless, eroding the myth of invincibility that had long sustained Imperial rule. Once fear of the Empire faded, cracks widened in the foundations of their authority. The Council's arrogance persisted outwardly, yet internal divisions began to surface. Some advocated escalating the conflict with extermination campaigns, scorched earth policies meant to erase humanity entirely. Others argued that such measures would only deepen rebellion across occupied worlds, risking the stability of the entire empire. What united them all, however, was a growing recognition that this war no longer conformed to their expectations. They were fighting an enemy not defined by material strength but by inexhaustible resolve, and that was an opponent for which no imperial doctrine had been prepared. Humanity, for its part, transformed suffering into fuel. Each atrocity committed against them became part of their collective memory, a reason to fight harder. Songs, literature, and broadcasts turned losses into legends. Children born in ruins grew up hearing the names of martyrs who had refused surrender, and they inherited that same defiance. For the Empire, time was supposed to be a weapon. Prolonged wars typically broke lesser species into compliance. Against humans, time became an ally, shaping new generations already hardened to conflict. Every cycle produced fighters more cunning and more relentless than the last. Even in defeat, humans refused to provide the Empire with satisfaction. Worlds declared pacified would erupt again without warning, as if the very soil itself rejected imperial rule. Garrisons could never relax, patrols never let down their guard, and the constant tension eroded the discipline once considered the Empire's defining strength. By forcing their enemy into endless vigilance, humanity drained the will of their occupiers long before they could drain their strength. The veteran's prophecy lingered over all of it, though few dared speak his name. He had warned that humans did not fear war, that they had been forged by it. Now every report carried evidence of his truth. The Empire had walked into a conflict believing victory inevitable, but instead found themselves facing an adversary who redefined what war meant. For humans, war was not a catastrophe to be avoided. It was a crucible that revealed their essence. The Empire, in refusing to believe it, had given them the very battlefield where they were strongest. The lesson grew undeniable. Humanity could not be subdued by force alone. They could only be eradicated at a cost so great it threatened the Empire's existence. And still, even with annihilation on the table, no commander could say with certainty that humans would ever accept defeat. The Empire's leaders eventually confronted a reality they had denied for too long. Victory over humanity would not come through overwhelming force or through the intimidation that had subjugated countless species before. Their fleets remained vast, their armies endless, but their advantage had been eroded by a war that refused to conform to their expectations. What began as a campaign of dominance had transformed into a contest of survival, and in that contest, humans thrived. The veteran's words, once dismissed, now lingered like a curse, echoes of a warning ignored until too late. Imperial strategy shifted desperately, moving from conquest to eradication. Entire settlements were targeted for destruction, cities erased from orbit, and planets reduced to ash in an effort to sever the roots of resistance. Yet such measures only amplified human fury. For every world burned, survivors emerged more determined, scattering to spread their defiance elsewhere. Annihilation did not inspire surrender but deepened hatred, binding humanity in unity stronger than any council decree could have managed. What the Empire failed to grasp was that humans measured survival not only in territory held, but in the will to resist. As long as even a fragment endured, the war was never over. Humanity's resilience began reshaping the wider galaxy. Species once resigned to imperial dominance now saw in humans a model of resistance. If a race considered weak and underdeveloped could hold back the tide, what excuse remained for those who had accepted chains? Insurgencies flared across distant sectors, emboldened by the knowledge that the Empire was not invincible. Supplies diverted to crush these uprisings further thinned the forces committed to the human front, creating a spiral of instability that even the most disciplined legions could not contain. The Empire was bleeding from wounds it had inflicted upon itself, and humans were the knife twisting deeper with every strike. The psychological toll became the true breaking point. Imperial soldiers no longer believed in the inevitability of their cause. Each deployment to human-controlled space felt less like service to a mighty empire and more like marching into a graveyard. Reports described humans who fought until the very moment of death, who detonated explosives while clutching their enemies, who turned defeat into defiance that echoed long after the battle ended. Such encounters wore down morale in ways no weapon could. For the first time in centuries, the Empire's armies felt fear, not of annihilation, but of an enemy who refused to grant them closure, who robbed them of the finality that victory was supposed to bring. Human strategy matured with brutal efficiency. They turned captured technology into new designs, hybrid weapons that blended imperial precision with their own ingenuity. Fleets once dismissed as fragile became predators, striking with calculated ferocity before vanishing into the void. Colonies hidden in asteroid belts and uncharted systems became fortresses, sustaining the war effort no matter how many planets fell. What had started as survival evolved into mastery, and the Empire realized it had not merely underestimated humanity's will, but underestimated their capacity to learn and improve under fire. Every cycle of conflict sharpened them into something more formidable than before. The High Council fractured under the weight of these failures. Factions debated retreat, extermination, or negotiation, each option carrying the scent of humiliation. To admit defeat was unthinkable, yet continuing the war threatened collapse. Humanity, once an afterthought, had forced the greatest power in the galaxy to question its future. The irony was bitter. The Council had ignored the words of one old veteran, believing fearlessness to be weakness, when in truth it was the foundation of their undoing. For humanity, survival was no longer enough. They no longer fought simply to resist occupation. They fought to ensure the Empire would never again threaten them or others. Their war had become something larger, a campaign to dismantle the illusion of imperial dominance that had held the galaxy in chains. Every victory, every act of defiance, chipped away at the myth that fear could rule forever. The humans had shown the truth. Empires built on intimidation crumble when confronted with those who refused to bow. The war did not end with treaties or neat resolutions. It dragged onward, a grinding struggle that reshaped both sides. Yet even as battles raged, the outcome was already clear. The Empire could destroy cities, burn worlds, and massacre millions, but it could not extinguish the will of humanity. In their refusal to fear war, humans had seized the one weapon the Empire could never wield, the unbreakable spirit to fight without end. That spirit became legend, whispered among rebels, feared by soldiers, and remembered by those who had once mocked it. The veteran's voice, long silenced by ridicule, proved prophetic. The Empire had ignored his warning, and in doing so, condemned itself to a war it could never truly win. Humanity had not merely survived, they had transformed conflict into their proving ground, turning every loss into strength, every scar into defiance. Against such a foe, the Empire's power meant nothing. War was the crucible of humans, and within it, they had revealed themselves unstoppable.